Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome to How Tuesdays at Lori's Country Cottage. Today we're going to talk about how to put binding on a quilt. I'm going to include some simple math to figure out how much binding you need and joining those tails at the end so that they're invisible. Join me. So your quilt is all ready for binding, but how much binding do you need? Let's do some simple math to figure out how much binding you need. In my example, my quilt is 62 by 82. I need to know the distance around my quilt. So for this example, 62 plus 82 plus 62 plus 82 is the perimeter of my quilt, and it equals 288 inches. So the total distance around my quilt is 288 inches. How much fabric do I need? Well, fabric that comes on the bolt is between 42 and 44 inches. I use 40 inches, it gives me a little leeway. So 288 divided by 40 inches, so how many strips of 40 inches does it take to go around my quilt? Is 7.2. I need 7.2 strips of fabric to go around my quilt. Now we can't buy or cut 7.2, so we're going to bump that up to 8 strips. If this number was 7.9, which is really close to 8, I would do 9. So we need 8 strips, cut whatever width you like to cut binding. I do 2 1/4 or 2 1/2, depending how much I want my binding to show up. For our example, let's use 2 1/2 inches. So 8 strips times 2 1/2 inches is 20 inches of fabric. 20 inches of fabric is right on the ½ meter mark. We need a little bit of wiggle room to straighten our fabric. So I'm going to buy 0.6 meters of the fabric I choose for binding, and I'm going to cut 8 strips at 2 1/2 inches. Next step is to sew them together, and I'll show you how to do that next. All right, here are my strips for binding. The first step is to remove your selvages. You never want your selvages in your binding. Selvages are woven differently and they wash and wear differently. So I laid my strips and I cut my selvages off so I know that's a perfect right angle. So here are my strips. I'm going to lay them right sides together and match both edges. The next step is to draw a line from corner to corner. Now here's a little trick. It's really hard to see that corner. So if you actually overlap, leave a little tag here and a little tag here, it's much easier to see your corners. And that gets trimmed off. So I'm going to draw my line, take it to my sewing machine, and stitch right on that line. I've done one to show you. Here are my 2 strips, and I've stitched on this line. So when I press this, I have a continuous strip. So take all of your 8 strips, sew them all together on the diagonal, and the next step is to trim off this extra fabric. So take a little ruler and trim that to 1/4 inch. There we go. Now I'm going to take this to my pressing surface and I'm going to press all of these seams open. We need them to lay nice and flat so we don't have bulk on our quilt. After I've pressed all the seams open, I'm going to take my continuous 8 strips and press it wrong sides together. Let me show you what that looks like. Okay, my binding strips are all together. Let me show you how almost invisible that is. And I would like to mention, the only time I would not use a diagonal join for binding is if I had a stripe. If I had a stripe, I would probably just cut that straight across and join it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance so that my stripes matched. So, to start with my binding, the first thing I want to say is this isn't the right way to put on binding, this is just my way of putting on binding. Lori showed a video quite a while ago how she does binding, and it's different than how I do it. This is how I was taught and I'm successful, so this is how I do it. So it's just a way of doing binding, not the right way of doing binding. I don't need any special tools to put binding on. I would always use a quilting or a top stitch needle when I'm doing binding. Quilting and top stitch needles have longer points, and it just helps going through those layers. If I were to use a very plush or full batting so that my quilt was really thick, or if I had minky, fireside, or cuddle on the back, I would probably switch to a top stitch needle. A top stitch needle has a longer eye, so it just allows the thread to move up and down within that eye when you're going through all those layers. So today, because my quilt uses a thin cotton batting and it's quite densely quilted, I'm just using a quilting needle so that I have a nice long point to go through those layers. Let me just zoom you in and I'll show you how I start and how I turn corners. All right, so I've got my binding kind of folded, and I just lay it on my lap so that I have some control over it. There's my binding. I don't know if I learned this or if I'm just a creature of habit. I always start in the bottom right-hand corner of my quilt. I don't know why. If I were working on a very large quilt, my quilt I'm working on today is only 60 by 60, but if it was a very large quilt, I would probably set my sewing machine up on a bigger table so I had more room, but today I'm just going to tough it out. So I'm going to plan to start stitching right about here, and I'm leaving myself a good 10-inch tail. I'm going to need that when it's time to join my tails at the end. Now, I could work out a formula for exactly where I need to stitch. Usually it's about 3/8 of an inch, but it does actually depend on the thickness of my batting, my fabric, and the quilt sandwich that I've made. So I always stitch a sample on a basting stitch to see if I have the right width. So I'm going to do that now. So no back stitch, and it's a giant stitch, and I'm lining my fabric up with the edge of my 1/4 inch presser foot, not the 1/4 inch toe, but the actual edge of the foot. And then I remove my quilt, I turn it to the back. Now I've used dark thread so that you can see it. And I'm going to see where does that lay. Oh, and it's absolutely perfect. So let me see if I can zoom in a bit more. I want, when I fold my binding to the back, to have it just cover my stitching line. And that's the perfect result I'm looking for this quilt. So I know that the edge of my 1/4 inch foot, not the 1/4 inch toe, but the edge of my foot is the correct distance for binding. So I'm going to pull that basting stitch out. I'm going to set my machine to a regular stitch length again. Every once in a while I forget that and I have to go back. All right. Now when I start, because I know my stitch width is going to be correct, I'm going to put a locking stitch on my machine, or just back stitch. There we go. Now I line my binding along the edge of my quilt and simply stitch, again using my guideline. Sometimes it's hard to move your fabric along, and it helps to wear quilting gloves like we do for free motion quilting to help that fabric move along, especially if you're working in a cramped space like I am today. My quilt really doesn't have anywhere to go. It's just pushed up against the wall, but I've done it enough that I can manage. All right, I'm coming up to the corner, and I'm going to take my ruler. Now I've done this a million times, so I know what the distance is. Just going to lift that up for you a bit. I'm going to measure from my needle to the edge of my presser foot, the guide that I'm using as my seam allowance, and it's 3/8 of an inch. So I need to stop my needle 3/8 of an inch from the end of my quilt. I've done this a lot, so I can eyeball it. If you don't want to eyeball it, lay your ruler on top, give yourself a pencil mark, and then you'll know exactly where to stop. So I'm going to stitch up into that point. I'm going to give one back stitch, and I'm going to take my quilt right away from my machine. Now, there are ways to do this without removing your quilt from the machine. This is just how I do it. Now I need to turn my quilt so that I'm going the correct direction. And I flip my strip up. So look how it creates a 45-degree angle. And I flip my strip down so that it matches along the top, and then it will also match along the edge. If you're having trouble managing your quilt, you can pin that. Now I simply put it under my presser foot and I start stitching with that same seam allowance. So I'm going to stitch to the other corner, and then I'll show you that one more time. Here's a second look. I'm coming up to my next corner. So I stitch with my regular seam allowance. For this quilt, it's about 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to stop 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of my quilt. Throw in one back stitch and then remove my quilt. If you don't have a thread cutter, you can leave that thread, it doesn't matter. I'm going to turn my quilt so I'm going the correct direction. Now this strip flips up to create a straight line, so up and then down. So when I pull it down, I'm aligning it with this edge, and it is also aligned along the top. Then I just slide it under my foot again, and right from the edge, start stitching. I'm going to finish stitching around my quilt, and then I'll be back to show you how to join your binding tails, no tools involved. Okay, I'm back. I've gone all the way around my quilt, and I'm back at the beginning. Here's my beginning tail, back stitched and about 10 inches long. I'm going to back stitch right here to secure these stitches, because we're going to be yanking on that when we are trying to join our tails. I have my extra fabric here, and I leave at least an 8-inch gap. It just makes it easier to join those tails. I'll show you how that's done next. Okay, I'm all ready to join my tails. Here they are. I've trimmed this down so I don't have so much bulk. The first thing I'm going to do is trim my top tail to about 5 inches. Now normally I don't even take this out of my machine. I do all of this in front of my machine, but it's much easier to show if I'm at my cutting table. So 2, 4, 5, so right about there. Clearly this is not an exact science, but I do want it to be straight. So I have an approximate 5-inch tail here. Now I need to overlap these two tails. The overlap needs to be the same size as my cut binding. So my binding, if you remember, we cut 2.5 inches. So I need to overlap these two strips 2.5 inches. So I can see where this strip starts. 1, 2, 2.5. I put a pin in. There's my 2.5 inch mark. So they overlap 2.5 inches right there. And I'm going to cut on that line. And again, make sure this is a nice square cut and pull that pin out before you do anything. There we go. So now my two strips overlap 2.5 inches. And now I'm going to join them on the diagonal just like we did with our binding strips. But you have to do it the right direction. So here's how I remember it. And I don't know who taught me this, but bottoms up. My bottom strip goes right side up. So bottoms up. And now I want to lay this perpendicular, but it's kind of hard with my quilt. So I quite often, actually almost always, gather my quilt up, and again, I do this when I'm at my sewing machine, and I throw one of my great big binding clips in. Now I don't have to tug on the fabric, it'll just stay. So bottoms up and top side down. And I'm going to join them just like, I got that a little bit tight. I was joining my binding. And yes, you're going to watch me fiddling with this fabric, and you're going to do the same thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is pin this edge, and then I'm going to pin this edge, and then I'm going to make sure everything is laying flat on the bottom, and I'm going to pin that direction. All right, now I need to draw a line just like when we were doing binding from corner to corner. Well, that would have been smart to use a flat-headed pin, which I always do at my machine. There we go. I can see my corner here and see my corner here. I'm going to draw my diagonal line. Now I'm going to take that to my machine and I'm going to stitch on that line. When I'm done, I'll show you what that looks like. All right, I've stitched my diagonal line, and I always, and I mean always, do a double check. Pull my pins, pull my binding, and make sure that it's going to lie flat. If you accidentally stitched this direction, you would not be able to pull those strips flat. So I always check, because if I stitched in the wrong direction and then I cut the tails off, the only way to fix that is to add more fabric. So I would have to sew another strip on. So now that I know this is indeed laying the right direction, I have some options. I can go to my cutting table and cut off this extra fabric with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or like I said, I do everything sitting at my machine. So I'm simply going to take my scissors and cut so that it's a 1/4 inch. Now I could get up and I could go to my pressing surface and I could press that flat. But again, economy of movement, I give it a really good finger press, and then when I fold my strip right sides together, I make sure that it's lying flat. So now all I need to do is put this back under my machine, line up my seam allowance from my last stitching, And look how nicely that fits. It's a perfect fit. And I'm just going to stitch that down. Lots of drag from my quilt here. And when I get back to my beginning stitches, I'm just going to throw in my locking stitch, cut my thread, and my bindings on. Well, the binding's on my quilt. The next step is hand stitching the binding. So I'm going to fold my binding to the back, put my binding clips all the way around, and you can join me on a future video and see how I do hand stitch binding. Thanks for joining me for How Tuesdays at Lori's Country Cottage.